The primary goal of Razor is really to allow you to intermingle code and HTML, C# and HTML, or Visual Basic and HTML. Instead of forcing you, the programmer, to explicitly denote which blocks of text are code and which blocks of text are HTML, it's up to the Razor parser to figure that out, and it does a pretty good job. If I use an @ sign and write a for each statement, Razor's going to figure out that that is a statement, that it needs to compile that into C# code. And if I do @movie.id inside of this anchor tag, Razor is smart enough to say, you must want to output the ID property of the movie into this location, and that would build me a properly formatted anchor tag. Likewise, I can say @movie.title, and the title will appear here. I want to point out that everything that you output using this syntax is automatically HTML encoded. Unlike ASP.NET, the web forms view engine, where we either had to explicitly encode using HTML.encode or use that special syntax, which was less than %: to encode things, Razor is encoded by default. If there's something that you do not want to encode, we'll take a look at that scenario in just a bit. Razor is also pretty good at figuring out the context of how you're using something. So the @ sign typically denotes that you want to emit something from C# code. But in this case, the @ sign is inside of an email address, and Razor is smart enough to figure that out too. It'll emit scott-allen@pluralsight.com as the email address instead of trying to treat pluralsight.com as some property access. There are cases, though, where you can fool the Razor parser. For instance, if you wanted to put out a Twitter handle and just said @odecode, in that case, Razor would think that you're trying to access something, a variable called odecode, and that'll throw a compilation error. But you can escape the @ sign with a double @. So @odecode will output the text @odecode. Inside of Visual Studio, it's always educational to see what happens when you have an error. So let me go ahead and enter odecode, and you can see just by the syntax coloring that the Razor parser thinks we're trying to emit a C# expression here. So when we run this view inside of the browser, we will have a compilation error. The name odecode does not exist in the current context. And just like ASPX files in ASP.NET, I can click to show detailed compiler output. I can see that the C# compiler is indeed involved in the compilation of this template. I can click to show complete compilation source. And this is essentially the C# code that is being generated by the Razor engine after it has parsed that template. This is very similar to what happens with ASPX files. Here you can see where the doc type is emitted at the top of our template. Here you can see where we're trying to write out odecode, the property value that doesn't exist. So let's flip back into Visual Studio and escape this and say @odecode. Then flip back into our view and refresh it, and everything works. So something else that was very subtle about that demonstration is that all I needed to do was save the template to disk and refresh the browser. I see the changes reflected in the browser. So these Razor templates are not being parsed and compiled into assemblies at build time. Very similar to what ASP.NET does with ASPX files is that the Razor view engine in MVC is taking care of telling the Razor engine to go out and parse these things, and then it compiles the results and loads them into an assembly and executes this template. But again, since Razor doesn't have an explicit dependency on ASP.NET, you could do the same thing from a console application or a Windows service. Let me demonstrate a few additional features of the Razor syntax. First of all, I can declare a code block. That's just an @ sign and then an opening and closing curly brace. Inside of here, I can write some C# code, just like we're setting the layout property equal to null here. I can also declare new variables. I can manipulate those variables. And then I could use those variables somewhere else in my code. For instance, outputting the value of name at this point. Razor also allows you to place comments in a template. You can also comment out code easily. I can select this block of code. Let's just select the markup and some C# code, come into Edit, Advanced and hit Comment Selection. I could also use that Control key mapping of Control K, Control C. When I do that, I get what's called a server-side comment. It's the @**. It's terminated with *@, and everything inside of here now is commented out. If we come out to the view and refresh it, you see we've also commented out even the text that did the output of the Twitter handle. Something else that you'll need to know how to do when you're working with Razor is how to turn an implicit code nugget into an explicit code nugget. First, let's uncomment this code, so I'll just select it, hit Control K, Control U, and we have our markup and C# code back again. This is an example of an implicit code nugget, just @name. It could appear anywhere. It could appear inside of HTML. And the Razor parser is smart enough to say, you want to output the value of this property or the value of this variable at this location. But there's some times when the Razor parser trips up a bit. For instance, imagine if we wanted to use @name to build the source of an image tag, which I want that to end with .jpeg. So I want this name to be scott.jpg. Unfortunately, what the Razor parser sees is that I'm trying to access a JPG property on a string variable, and I get a compilation error. And this is a case where I want to turn an implicit code nugget into an explicit code nugget, and I can do that by putting parentheses around the C# expression that I want evaluated. So I want the value of the name variable output here, and then .jpg tacked on to the end. So now we should be able to save this and refresh our view, and I do not actually have an image file out there called scott.jpg, but you can see that what we actually put into the page source is what I wanted, image source equals scott.jpg. There's a similar scenario that can happen, which is sometimes the Razor parser doesn't quite understand when you want to transition from C# code into text. And I'll demonstrate this by pasting in an if-else block. If name starts with capital S, then we'll write out a div that says your name starts with S. Otherwise, we'll write out a div that says your name doesn't start with S. You can tell just by the background subtle shade here that the Razor parser understands that this part is C# code, this part is HTML. Indeed, if I save this view and we come out and refresh it, we'll see your name doesn't start with a capital S. But what if I didn't want a div inside of here? What if I just wanted that text, your name starts with S? And actually we should change it down here. This is the condition that will hit, your name doesn't start with S. In that case, the Razor parser isn't smart enough to say, this should be really text that's output. If we refresh the view, what we'll find is a compilation error. The problem here is that the Razor parser doesn't have that opening angle bracket of the div tag to look at this and say, oh, you must be starting some text or HTML block here. Fortunately, there is an easy way to fix this problem, and that is to use a text tag. Now, a text tag will not appear in the output, so you won't see text and /text in the browser output. It's merely a tag that exists so that Razor understands where you want to transition from C# code back into literal text. So we can save this view, we can reload it in the browser, and you can see your name doesn't start with S, that's good. If we view the page source, you'll notice there's no text tags around that text. We could have also used an HTML span tag here. That would appear in the generated HTML. It all depends on what you want your markup to look like. Just understand that you have a couple different tools to switch between C# code and text. One is the text tag. One is to make a code expression explicit by using parentheses.